This fight doesn't start with swords. It starts with a cheap curved brass horn weighing barely 5 pounds. It can't cut anyone, but when hundreds of guys blow into these hollow tubes at the exact same time, it creates a deafening screech. Staring down that wall of noise is 240 tons of raw, panicking animal muscle. In less than 20 seconds, 80 elephants freak out, spin around, and stomp the ribcages of their own frontline soldiers into the dirt. The guy who once conquered the freezing Alps is now standing totally helpless on a flat pan of sand. Why would history's greatest tactical genius bet the fate of a 500-year-old empire on the mood swings of wild animals? Hannibal wasn't outplayed by better Roman soldiers. He got taken out by a sick paradox. The man who spent his life using nature to kill his enemies got murdered by nature itself. His ultimate biological weapon just panicked and chewed up his own army. Using AI reconstruction, we're dropping right into the dirt at Zama in 202 BC. There's Hannibal Barca, totally isolated, staring down a massive Roman war machine with a starving army that his own bosses abandoned 15 years ago. But here we aren't listening to the epic myths of ancient history. We're getting down in the mud to audit the brutal math. Every broken shield, every starving stomach, and every single breath blown into a cheap brass horn. Welcome to the trial of Hannibal Barca, and I am Oxley. How does a tactical genius end up betting his entire empire on wild animals? To understand this, you have to look away from the battlefield and look at a brutal 5,475-day invoice of pure abandonment. For 15 years in Italy, Hannibal's army was bled dry. They didn't get a single wheat shipment from home. While 40,000 starving men boiled dirty roots just to stay alive, the politicians back in Carthage ran the numbers. They kept 25,000 of their best troops locked down in Iberia, not to help their greatest general, but to guard the empire's cash cow, the silver mines. Just like Napoleon freezing in Russia centuries later, Carthage was dying because their supply chain snapped. But the devastating truth is, ultimately, the thing that killed Hannibal's army wasn't a Roman sword. It was a calculated, mathematical betrayal by his own government, a ruling class that cared more about mining silver than keeping their soldiers breathing. Look closely at Hannibal's best veterans at Zama. They're walking into this final fight wearing horribly rusted, blood-stained chainmail. Where did this rotting armor come from? It carries a dark physical memory. With zero fresh iron coming from home, these guys had to scavenge just to protect their chests. 14 years earlier, they knelt in the mud and ripped this exact armor off the 70,000 Roman corpses they left at Cannae. As the historian Polybius noted, the Carthaginian army looked like a freak show of ghosts, wearing the gear of the men they killed. Even their boots were held together by the raw skin of dead horses. Yet, fast forward to today, archaeologists are pulling these exact melted, rusted iron links out of the sand. It proves just how far human endurance can go. To defend their home, these veterans literally had to wear the rotting iron skins of dead enemies just to survive one more day. Beyond starvation and rust, the ground itself was out to kill them. Why was the flat dirt of Zama a total death sentence for history's greatest predator? Because this battlefield has zero blind spots. It's a massive, flat frying pan under the North African sun. At Trasimene, Hannibal used fog to hide his army. At Cannae, he used dust storms. But here, it's a naked chopping block. No trees to hide cavalry, no hills to slow down the Roman heavy infantry. 40,000 starving men are sitting ducks in the blistering heat, pushed into a straight-up, head-to-head meat grinder. and this creates a terrifying paradox. In the end, the ultimate master of the ambush got murdered by an environment that refused to hide him. The flat ground didn't just box him in, it stripped away his superpower, forcing a genius into a dumb, blunt force fistfight. Just a few hundred miles from this slaughter, the capital of Carthage was sitting on mountains of wealth. So why didn't the rich elites send a rescue fleet to their dying men? Because the merchants running the Senate didn't care about glory. They only cared about the bottom line. Years ago, they did the math. The wood and copper it takes to build just one warship could build 10 highly profitable spice trading boats. When faced with the cost of breaking the Roman blockade, the politicians made their choice. They let 40,000 men starve in the dirt at Zama rather than take a hit to their daily shipping profits. This betrayal points to a brutal reality. Basically, when the price of winning a war costs more than a harbor makes in profit, the elites will always write it off. Those soldiers were liquidated just to protect the empire's balance sheets. Facing a choked supply line and a massive Roman army, you have to ask, why didn't a genius like Hannibal just surrender and cut a deal when the math clearly failed? He was handcuffed by a ghost. Decades ago, as a 9-year-old kid, he bled over an altar and swore an oath to the god Baal, never be a friend to Rome. The politicians back home weaponized that childhood promise. They turned it into an ironclad law that permanently stripped him of the right to surrender. All historians like Livy call this bravery, but modern experts see it for what it was, a political death trap, a perfectly designed collar that killed any chance of peace. Today, we call this the ultimate ideological hostage situation, meaning, to keep the government looking strong, the pride of an entire nation had to be paid for with the blood of 40,000 men. Hannibal didn't walk into the meat grinder out of ego. He did it because his bosses legally locked the exit door. Stripped of his tricks and abandoned by his boss, Hannibal is staring at a terrifying brick wall, the overlapping iron shields of the Roman infantry. How do you smash solid metal when you don't have a single catapult? Thanks to his dead supply lines, Hannibal didn't have an ounce of iron or oak to build battering rams. His men, holding chipped, recycled swords, are completely useless against this Roman wall of steel. He desperately needs massive hitting power to crack the enemy's line open. But the Senate cut his funding for heavy weapons. He is backed into a corner by the harsh math of war, left with zero mechanical leverage. Ultimately, this lack of iron forces the commander to do something crazy. Instead of using precision artillery, he has to weaponize the raw, dumb muscle of living animals just to get the job done. That's exactly why 80 ancient North African elephants are violently shoved to the front line. These aren't symbols of royal pride, they're a giant red flag of desperation. Decades ago, Hannibal's elephants crossed the Alps and terrified Europe. They were psychological weapons. But here at Zama, they're just giant, living wrecking balls. Each 3-ton beast is drafted to do the dirty work of a missing battering ram. Hannibal is betting the entire future of his empire on 240 tons of raw meat and ivory. It's like the Soviets throwing waves of cheap T-34 tanks at German engineering at Kursk. Carthage is swapping out smart machines for sheer animal bulk. They're throwing living rocks into a metal grinder. Flesh is ordered to break steel. In the end, this is the ultimate tragic joke of Zama. Putting the elephants up front wasn't a flex of power. It was the duct-taped, desperate fix of a starved genius trying to replace machines with wild animals. The biggest showdown of the ancient world didn't kick off with some glorious sword fight. It started with pure terrifying physics. Zooming in on the battlefield, Hannibal aggressively unleashes 80 North African forest elephants across the hot sand. Just look at the math here. 240 tons of raw muscle, bone, and ivory charging full speed across completely flat dirt. You could literally feel the ground shake. Those massive vibrations traveled straight through the earth, hitting the nailed boots of 34,000 Roman soldiers standing perfectly still. All the mind games are gone. Hannibal just desperately needed brute force to crack that Roman steel open. But the brutal reality is, ultimately, throwing this massive wall of animals at the Romans wasn't a flex of power. It was everything Carthage had left. They were frantically hurling animals at an iron wall because they didn't have the machines to do it. Staring down 240 tons of charging animals, Scipio didn't order his guys to brace for impact. He beat brute force with basic math. To understand how, look back 14 years to the bloodbath at Cannae. There, the Roman army was totally wiped out because they packed themselves together too tightly and got crushed. Scipio learned from that slaughter. Instead of the usual checkerboard setup, he ordered his men to line up in straight, parallel columns. As the historian Polybius wrote down, this simple shift suddenly opened up wide, empty lanes slicing right through the Roman army. All that terrifying momentum from the elephants suddenly had absolutely nothing to hit. And this means Rome didn't try to muscle their way out of a disaster. Using simple geometry, they just opened the door and let the avalanche slide right past them without dropping a single bead of sweat or blood. Now that the 80 elephants are perfectly trapped in those empty lanes, Rome pulls out its real weapon, and it's completely invisible. Looking closely at the Roman lines, thousands of soldiers called cornicants don't draw swords. They hoist these massive 3-meter brass tubes onto their shoulders. When they blow hard into the cornu, combined with the straight tuba horns, it creates a deafening, high-pitched screech. The hard-baked desert floor acts like a giant speaker, bouncing that solid wall of noise straight into the animal's ultra-sensitive ears. The battlefield is instantly choked by this insane, mechanical screaming, pushing the elephants way past their breaking point. Until something snaps. Basically, the smartest military brain of the ancient world got hacked by basic acoustic physics. Just 5 pounds of hollow brass completely short-circuited the minds of Carthage's heaviest hitters. What happens when you put 240 tons of highly sensitive animals through pure sensory hell? The Carthaginian front line is about to find out. For years, modern biologists studying stampedes have known that when a herd hits peak panic, military training goes right out the window. Driven absolutely crazy by the noise, the elephants violently spin 180 degrees. Trying to escape the wall of sound, they charge straight back into their own guys. The first victims are the Celtic mercenaries standing at the front. They don't get a quick, honorable death by a Roman sword. Instead, thousands of human rib cages are completely flattened into the dirt by the massive, panicked feet of their own animals. Yet, the reality is, Carthage's biggest advantage mutated into a giant, out-of-control suicide machine. That biological boomerang chewed up its own infantry way faster than the Romans ever could. Surviving that horrific stampede, thousands of terrified Celtic mercenaries turn around and run for their lives toward the Carthaginian second line. They are begging to be let in. Right at this moment, Hannibal is looking at a nightmare scenario. If he lets these panicking bloody guys break through his organized ranks, his whole defensive line collapses like dominoes. Empathy isn't an option here. It's just cold, hard survival math. Standing behind the wall of shields, the Carthaginian boss gives a chilling, robotic order to his veterans. He tells them to lower their spears, lock their arms, and stab their fleeing allies right in the chest. And here is the hardest pill to swallow. In the end, just to keep 1 square meter of the battlefield intact, the Carthaginian army had to butcher the very guys who just took a beating for them. Keeping order was paid for entirely in friendly blood. Why would one of history's greatest generals build a formation that practically guarantees his own front line gets slaughtered? To get it, you have to look at Hannibal's cold, hard math, shaped by years of grinding war in Italy. Those frontline mercenaries were never hired to win the battle. They were human sandbags, a meat shield set up just to absorb the first heavy punch from the Romans. Their screaming, dying bodies piled up in the dirt served one brutal purpose. Their flesh and bone were literally meant to dull the sharp edges of the Roman swords before those blades ever reached Hannibal's best guys. This tactical math reveals a sick truth. Every safe inch in the back was bought and paid for with gallons of hot blood in the front. Those mercenaries weren't soldiers. They were just living speed bumps thrown away to tire out the enemy's arms. Stepping over the massive pile of their dead allies, 15,000 Italian veterans finally crash into the Roman line. But this is just a 15-minute illusion of survival. Looking at the horizon, the real executioner shows up. While the veterans are desperately hacking their chipped swords against fresh Roman steel, a massive dust cloud blocks the sun. 6,100 elite Roman and Numidian cavalrymen just wiped out Carthage's horsemen and are swinging around to hit Hannibal from behind. Being short by exactly 2,100 horses mathematically guaranteed that Carthage's flanks would collapse. Jump to today, and archaeologists are digging up the melted iron armor of these trapped men from the Tunisian sand, the physical leftovers of a trap snapping shut. And here is the ultimate cruel joke. The greatest tactical genius in history, the guy who spent his life using nature, like fog and snow, to kill his enemies, got betrayed by nature itself. His animals freaked out, and his empire was erased by a 5-pound brass horn. The grueling standoff between Carthage's veterans and the Roman infantry is ripped apart by a low, rumbling earthquake. Time is officially up, and you see 6,100 Roman and Numidian cavalry slamming full speed into the back of Hannibal's lines. The exact same guys who spent 15 years tearing Rome apart are now getting speared through the back, where they have 0 armor and 0 shields. It's not a battle anymore. It's just a straight-up execution. The cavalry simply runs them over. The reality is, Hannibal's undefeated 15-year streak gets completely crushed the second those 2 massive metal jaws snap shut. The lid on the coffin is permanently nailed down. When the dust finally settles at Zama, the North African sun lights up a completely sick, lopsided receipt of death. Take a look at the official numbers the Roman Senate proudly recorded. 20,000 Carthaginian corpses piled high, bleeding out into the sand. Another 20,000 men bound by rough rope and shipped off to the slave markets. Meanwhile, Scipio's forces reported a loss of barely 1,500 men. A ratio of 40,000 to 15,500 isn't a battle, it's an absolute wipeout. But you have to question the math written by the victors. Modern military analysts laugh at this report. They know that during those final 2 hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat against Hannibal's hardened veterans, Roman blood definitely spilled at 3, maybe 4 times that 1,500 mark. But Rome simply did what every empire does. They erased their own dead from the paperwork just to forge a living god named Scipio. Because the math tells a terrifying story, basically, the war machine that bled Italy dry for 15 straight years got its entire defense force wiped off the map in a single afternoon. The sheer weight of the numbers just absolutely crushed them. With a Roman sword basically at their throats, the rich merchants running Carthage make a choice the only way they know how, by looking at their wallets. They agree to burn their entire proud fleet of 500 warships to ashes. They agree to hand over 10,000 talents of solid silver, a massive bailout debt that will choke their economy for 50 straight years. Think back to their golden age when they owned the seas. Now, to these guys, writing off 20,000 dead soldiers at Zama was just cheaper than letting their spice trading routes freeze up for another week. But here is the catch. When a government cares more about corporate profits than the guys taking bullets for them, they aren't buying peace. They're just signing a 50-year suicide pact. Dig through the bloody sand and burned elephant ivory at Zama, and you'll find a bent, dirty Roman brass horn. It's beat up, it's full of dirt. No one is ever going to blow through it again. Jump to today, and tourists walk right past stuff like this in the Louvre, treating it like a rusty piece of trash. They have absolutely no clue that this hollow chunk of metal, weighing barely 5 pounds, is the exact murder weapon that took down a 500-year-old maritime superpower. And that is the sickest twist of all, meaning, just by blasting a high-pitched noise, this cheap hollow tube didn't just break the elephant's eardrums. It permanently shattered Carthage's right to exist. So why didn't Hannibal's 15-year undefeated streak in Italy bring him eternal glory? Why did it actually plant the seeds for his own destruction? Because his absolute brilliance forced Rome to level up. To survive Hannibal, Rome had to build a meaner, more professional killing machine, and they put Scipio in charge. A guy who spent years taking notes on every single move Hannibal made. It's exactly like massive tech giants today getting wiped out by their own ex-engineers who stole the source code, which leads to a crazy realization. Basically, the war machine that crushed Carthage at Zama wasn't a Roman invention. It was built using the exact tactical DNA that Hannibal spoon-fed them for 15 straight years. Did selling out and signing that massive bailout at Zama actually save Carthage, like the rich elites planned? 50 years later, Rome comes back. This time, no deals, no debt payments. They burn the city to the ground, slaughter everyone, and pour salt all over the dirt, so absolutely nothing will ever grow there again. Pull up Google Maps today, and the ground around Tunis is still physically scarred. That smart financial surrender at Zama, it was just kicking the can down the road. Because history proves one harsh rule. When you sell out your military and your pride just to buy a temporary peace treaty, you aren't saving yourself. You're just laying out the welcome mat for your own total extermination. Hannibal doesn't walk away from Zama looking like a glorious martyr. He walks away as a fossil, a guy totally left behind by a new era. He spent 15 grinding years sharpening his sword in Italy, only to watch his entire legacy get vaporized in a few hours. That's the ultimate twisted joke of nature. Hannibal, absolute perfection, is exactly what forced his enemy to evolve and create the perfect weapon to kill him. Which leaves us with a terrifying question. When we get arrogant and try to bend the rules of nature to get what we want, are we just building the exact 5-pound brass horn that's going to completely ruin our own future? If you believe humanity will have a different outcome, prove it below. And I am Oxley. History allows no appeals.